At 25,000 feet above Europe, the temperature inside the bomber dropped to nearly 40 degrees below zero. 10 men sat inside the narrow aluminum fuselage, each wrapped in layers of heavy clothing that still could not keep the cold away. Oxygen masks covered their faces. Frost formed along the metal walls of the aircraft. They had already been flying for nearly 4 hours. Through the small plexiglass windows, the gray outline of the German coastline slowly grew larger. The aircraft surrounding them were identical. B-17 flying fortresses. At least that was the name people used on the ground. But the men who flew them knew something different. Fortresses did not shake when anti-aircraft shells exploded 60 feet away. Fortresses did not rely on rubber oxygen masks just to keep their defenders conscious. And real fortresses did not burn when a single incendiary round pierced the wing and ignited fuel lines running through the aircraft like veins. Yet the B-17 would become one of the most famous aircraft of the Second World War. Photographs circulated across the United States showing bombers returning from missions that looked impossible to survive. Aircraft landed with tails nearly torn away, engines missing, large sections of fuselage ripped open by explosions. Still they returned. Those photographs became proof of the bomber's toughness. Newsreels celebrated the aircraft that could absorb punishment and keep flying. Recruitment posters promised safety in numbers, guns pointing in every direction, armor protecting the crew. But the photographs never showed the mathematics of the war. For every B-17 that limped back to England with catastrophic damage, another disappeared somewhere over Germany. For every crew that finished their combat tour, others vanished on their third mission, or their seventh, or their 24th. The 8th Air Force, flying most American B-17 missions from bases in England, suffered losses that rivaled entire ground divisions. By the time Germany surrendered, tens of thousands of American aircrew had been killed, captured, or listed as missing. The men who flew those missions understood something the public rarely saw. The B-17 was not a fortress. It was a slow aircraft flying for hours through hostile airspace. Its strength came from formation flying. Dozens of bombers packed tightly together so their machine guns could cover one another. But that formation created another problem. It meant the bombers had to fly straight. Predictable, easy to track. During the bombing run, the aircraft could not turn or dive. The Norden bomb sight, the secret device meant to guide bombs precisely onto their targets, required the bomber to hold steady flight. So when the flak began, the crews had no choice but to fly directly through it. Black clouds appeared in the sky around the formation. Moments later, the explosions arrived. Shells burst at precise altitudes, scattering thousands of fragments through the air. Shrapnel tore through aluminum skin, through plexiglass windows, through human bodies. A direct hit could destroy a bomber instantly. But even a near miss could sever control cables, ignite fuel tanks, or wound the pilots. Fighter attacks were just as deadly. German pilots learned quickly how to exploit weaknesses in the bomber formations. They attacked from angles where fewer guns could fire. They targeted aircraft drifting out of formation. They focused on bombers already damaged. Some attacked head-on at terrifying speeds. At those closing velocities, bomber gunners had only seconds to aim, only seconds to survive. On paper, the B-17 carried 13 machine guns. In reality, those guns were operated by young men wearing thick gloves in freezing temperatures. Guns jammed, turrets froze, ammunition belts tangled, and even when everything worked perfectly, hitting a fighter moving 300 miles per hour from a bomber flying half that speed required extraordinary luck. Within the first months of operations over Europe, losses mounted quickly. The truth became impossible to ignore. The B-17 could not protect itself. And yet the missions continued. Because there was no alternative. American strategic planners believed daylight bombing could destroy Germany's industrial power without requiring a massive ground invasion. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries. Destroy those, and the enemy's ability to fight would collapse. The B-17 had been built to carry out that plan. It could fly higher than most earlier bombers. It carried heavy defensive guns, and it was strong enough to absorb damage that would destroy lighter aircraft. But survival inside a bomber formation depended on more than engineering. It depended on discipline, training, and luck measured in inches, sometimes in fractions of inches. A bomber that drifted too far from formation became something every crew feared. A straggler, alone in the sky, isolated, slow, and easy to attack. German fighter pilots watched the formations carefully, waiting for exactly that moment. One damaged aircraft falling slightly behind the others was enough. Once separated, a bomber could be surrounded within seconds. The hours of a mission passed in a strange mixture of boredom and terror. Most of the time, nothing happened at all. The engines droned steadily. The aircraft vibrated with a constant mechanical rhythm that every crew member eventually learned to ignore. Men checked their oxygen lines, inspected their guns, adjusted gloves stiff with frost. They waited. Then suddenly the sky exploded. Flak appeared first as dark puffs in the distance, almost peaceful looking from far away. Only when the shells burst closer did the real danger arrive. Steel fragments ripped through the air at incredible speed. A single piece of shrapnel could cut a fuel line, smash an instrument panel, or tear through a crewman standing at his gun position. Enemy fighters appeared next. Tiny dots on the horizon slowly grew larger until their shapes became unmistakable. Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, fast, aggressive machines climbing toward the bomber formation. The shift from quiet routine to violent combat happened in seconds. One moment the crew watched empty sky. The next moment bullets and cannon shells streaked past the aircraft. But as the war continued, something began to change. The German Air Force, once one of the most dangerous in the world, slowly started to weaken. At first the change was barely noticeable. Then it accelerated. Fuel became Germany's greatest problem. American bombers began targeting synthetic oil plants that produced aviation fuel. Each destroyed refinery meant fewer fighters could take off. Aircraft remained parked on airfields, ready to fly but unable to move without fuel. Pilot losses created another problem. The experienced fighter pilots who had dominated early air battles were gradually killed or wounded. Their replacements were younger, less trained, and often inexperienced. Training programs that once produced skilled pilots now rushed men through basic instruction simply to fill empty cockpits. At the same time, the Americans introduced something that completely changed the air war: long-range escort fighters. The P-51 Mustang, the P-47 Thunderbolt, the P-38 Lightning. These aircraft could fly with the bomber formations deep into German territory, protecting them all the way to the target and back. German fighters that once hunted bombers suddenly found themselves hunted instead. American escorts roamed ahead of the bomber stream, attacking German aircraft before they could even reach the formations. The skies over Germany slowly shifted in balance. Fighter controllers struggled to coordinate defenses as radar stations were bombed and communication networks disrupted. German pilots who managed to take off often climbed into skies already filled with American fighters waiting for them. Then Germany introduced a weapon that seemed capable of changing everything: the Me-262 jet fighter. It was faster than any aircraft in the sky. Its engines allowed it to approach bomber formations at speeds that piston engine fighters could not match. When the jets attacked, they could strike quickly and escape before escort fighters could react. But the Me-262 appeared too late. Germany no longer had the fuel to operate large numbers of jets. Pilots trained to fly them were rare, and maintenance requirements were demanding. Many jets sat on airfields that were themselves targets for American bombing. The aircraft proved what was possible, but they arrived in a war that Germany had already begun to lose. By early 1945, something unexpected happened during many B-17 missions. Silence. Crews flying toward Germany sometimes saw no fighters at all. The skies that had once been filled with attacking aircraft became strangely empty. But one enemy never disappeared: flak. Anti-aircraft guns did not need aviation fuel. They required only ammunition and people willing to operate them. German cities were protected by thousands of heavy guns capable of firing shells to the altitudes where bombers flew. As fighter attacks decreased, the flak became even more deadly. Bombers had to fly straight and level during the bombing run so the bombardier could aim accurately using the Norden bomb sight. That meant the aircraft could not maneuver to avoid the explosions. They flew directly into walls of flak. Shells burst around them, filling the air with metal fragments. Sometimes the sky looked almost black with explosions. Crews watched the aircraft ahead of them carefully. If a bomber suddenly disappeared inside a cloud of smoke and fire, everyone understood what had happened. Sometimes there was no explosion at all. An aircraft simply drifted downward, slowly leaving the formation. Those bombers rarely returned. The reduction in fighter attacks should have made missions safer. Instead, losses often remained steady. The reason was simple. The B-17 was designed to survive certain kinds of damage, but its weaknesses remained deadly. Fuel lines running through the wings were protected by little more than thin aluminum skin. The cockpit provided excellent visibility, but very little armor. And the bomb bay carried thousands of pounds of explosives. Fire was the danger crews feared most. An engine fire could sometimes be controlled. Fuel flow could be cut off. The propeller could be feathered. But a fire inside the wing was different. The burning fuel that powered the aircraft became the same fuel feeding the flames. Once the fire reached the main tanks, the bomber often exploded within seconds. Training taught crews how to abandon a damaged aircraft. Each man had an assigned exit point. Parachutes were always nearby. But real combat rarely followed training procedures. A bomber spinning out of control could trap men against the walls of the aircraft. A steep dive made movement nearly impossible. Smoke from a fire filled the fuselage so quickly that exits became impossible to find. Many B-17 losses left no survivors at all. Even those who managed to jump still faced danger. Parachuting from 25,000 feet meant falling through extreme cold and thin air. And once they reached the ground, another uncertainty began. Capture. Not every downed airman was treated the same. Some landed near German military units and were taken prisoner according to the rules of war. Others landed near civilians who had just watched their homes destroyed by bombing raids. Anger sometimes replaced the rules. And for the airmen descending slowly toward the ground, there was no way to know which reception waited below. Airmen who survived the fall usually entered a system that was designed to process them quickly. German military units were supposed to take custody of captured aircrew and move them through interrogation centers before sending them to prisoner of war camps. The process was organized and methodical. The Luftwaffe had spent years refining its procedures. Interrogators rarely relied on violence. Instead, they relied on information. Captured airmen were often surprised by how much their captors already knew. German officers sometimes knew the prisoner's squadron, the type of aircraft he flew, even the airfield from which he had departed. The goal was psychological pressure. If a prisoner believed the interrogator already knew everything, resistance seemed pointless. But American crews were trained carefully before flying combat missions. They were taught that prisoners of war were required to provide only 3 pieces of information: name, rank, serial number, nothing more. Some men held to that rule with stubborn discipline. Others found the pressure harder to resist, especially after hours or days of questioning. Those who refused to cooperate too completely sometimes found themselves placed in solitary confinement. Small, dark cells, bare walls, long hours with nothing to do but wait. Eventually, most prisoners were transferred to permanent camps. Conditions varied widely depending on the location and the stage of the war. Some camps were run with reasonable discipline. Others were harsh places where shortages of food, medicine, and basic supplies slowly weakened the prisoners inside. Food quickly became the center of daily life. German rations were minimal. Red Cross packages sent from Allied countries provided additional food that often meant the difference between hunger and survival. When those packages stopped arriving, conditions inside the camps deteriorated rapidly. Winter made everything worse. Many camps had poor heating. Prisoners wore clothing that had been designed for combat missions, not for long months behind barbed wire. Illness spread easily. Men who had survived being shot down sometimes died later from pneumonia, infections, or diseases that could have been treated easily under normal conditions. Yet the psychological strain of captivity was often just as difficult as the physical hardship. Bomber crews had been trained for action, for movement, for missions. Inside the camps, time moved slowly. Days became routines of waiting, counting rations, walking small circles inside fenced compounds. Some prisoners attempted escape. A few succeeded. Most did not. Those who were caught faced punishment that ranged from solitary confinement to transfer to harsher camps. Still, the attempts continued. The idea of freedom was difficult to abandon. While these men waited behind fences, The war continued in the skies above Europe, and the B-17 continued flying. But Europe was not the only place where these bombers operated. The Pacific War demanded something different. Distances there were enormous. European missions measured distance in hundreds of miles. Pacific missions sometimes measured it in thousands. Targets were scattered across islands surrounded by endless ocean. There were no cities to navigate by, no railroads or rivers to guide the crews home. And if an aircraft went down over water, the chances of survival were far lower. Early in the war, B-17s flew reconnaissance and bombing missions across vast areas of the Pacific. The aircraft had not been designed for such distances, and many missions pushed both machine and crew to their limits. Navigation became one of the most critical skills aboard the aircraft. The navigator worked constantly, calculating position using dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and whatever radio signals might be available. Even a small error could grow into a massive mistake over long distances. A bomber searching for a tiny island target in a huge ocean might miss it entirely. If the crew could not find their target or their base, the aircraft might simply run out of fuel somewhere over empty water. Many B-17s lost in the Pacific left no trace at all. The ocean swallowed them completely. Families at home received notices that their sons were missing, not because anyone believed they were alive, but because there was no proof of what had happened. Rescue systems gradually improved during the war. Submarines were stationed along some flight routes to pick up downed airmen. Flying boats could land on open water to rescue survivors. Air-sea rescue units became more effective as the war progressed. But many crews disappeared before those systems existed, before procedures were developed, before anyone fully understood how different Pacific air warfare would be. Even in Europe, dangers existed that had nothing to do with enemy action. Weather was one of them. The B-17 was designed to fly above most storms. In reality, storms often climbed higher than the aircraft itself. Winter operations created some of the most dangerous conditions crews would ever face. Ice formed quickly on wings and control surfaces, changing the way the aircraft behaved in the air. De-icing systems could remove some of the accumulation, but they were far from perfect. Ice added weight. It increased stall speed. It made controls sluggish and unpredictable. Pilots sometimes tried to descend into warmer air to escape icing conditions. But that option was not always available. Enemy territory lay below. Fuel reserves were limited, or the storm extended all the way to the ground. In those situations, the crew could only continue forward and hope the aircraft remained controllable. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it did not. Some of the most tragic losses of the bomber war happened without a single enemy fighter appearing. Aircraft that had survived combat simply vanished during storms or crashed during instrument approaches in fog. Investigations rarely produced answers. Bombers that disappeared over the North Sea during winter storms left no wreckage to examine. Crews that crashed during fog-covered landings could not explain what had gone wrong. Their names were recorded. The loss reports were filed, and the next mission was planned. By the final months of the war, the skies over Germany had changed dramatically. The Luftwaffe was collapsing. Fuel shortages kept many German aircraft on the ground. Experienced pilots had been lost in combat and replaced by young men with only limited training. Radar stations were destroyed, airfields bombed repeatedly, and coordination between defensive units became increasingly difficult. For B-17 crews, the reduction in fighter opposition should have meant safer missions. But the losses continued, because the dangers of flying heavy bombers did not disappear when the enemy weakened. The aircraft themselves had been flying for years. Many B-17s had completed dozens of missions, accumulating invisible fatigue in their metal frames. Repairs were made quickly between operations. Engines were replaced. Bullet holes were patched. Damaged control surfaces were repaired. But metal fatigue could not always be seen. Airframes stressed beyond their design limits sometimes failed suddenly. Accidents during the last months of the war were often caused by ordinary mechanical problems. An engine failure during takeoff. Landing gear collapsing on a wet runway. Brake failures. Fuel systems that malfunctioned at the worst possible moment. Each accident killed crews just as surely as enemy fire. The pace of operations actually increased as the war approached its end. Commanders wanted to destroy the remaining German industrial capacity before Allied armies reached those targets on the ground. Aircraft that might once have been grounded for maintenance continued flying. Crews who should have been rested flew additional missions. And many of the airmen flying those final missions were replacements. Young crews arriving late in the war often had less training than the veterans who had flown during the brutal years of 1943 and 1944. They made mistakes experienced crews might have avoided. Formation spacing drifted. Fuel calculations were misjudged. Emergency procedures were followed exactly as taught in training, but sometimes those procedures were wrong for the situation unfolding in the sky. Even the veterans were affected by something else. Fatigue. Not the simple exhaustion of a long flight, but the deeper fatigue that came from flying mission after mission while watching friends disappear. Men who had survived 20 missions sometimes flew their next sortie with less caution than they had during their first few flights. Routine created confidence. Confidence slowly became carelessness. Near misses that once would have frightened them were dismissed as proof that luck still held. Until the day it didn't. Many of the final losses of the European bombing campaign happened during missions that should have been routine. A bomber falling out of formation. A mechanical failure. A collision in cloud. Sometimes the exact cause was never known. The aircraft simply disappeared. For the families at home, the end of the war came in very different ways. Some families celebrated the return of sons and husbands stepping off ships and trains. Others received telegrams, short messages informing them that their loved one was missing or killed during operations. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war ended overnight for millions of people. But not for those families. Recovery teams continued searching crash sites for months after the fighting stopped. Wreckage was examined. Remains were identified when possible. Many airmen were never found. Graves marked unknown filled military cemeteries across Europe. Prisoners of war slowly returned home as camps were liberated. For them, the transition was strange. They had spent months or years behind barbed wire while the world outside continued changing. When they came home, they discovered families that had grown older, communities that had moved on, a country celebrating victory. Few people asked what had happened inside the bomber formations over Germany, and many veterans chose not to speak about it. Official histories of the war focused on strategy, on the number of bombs dropped, on the factories destroyed. The statistics were impressive, but numbers could never describe what those missions had actually been like. The aircraft themselves disappeared quickly after the war. Thousands of bombers were scrapped. Their aluminum melted down and reused in the booming civilian economy. Cars, buildings, household appliances. Only a small number of B-17s were preserved in museums. Yet the legend of the Flying Fortress continued to grow. Photographs of heavily damaged bombers returning safely became symbols of American determination. Stories focused on the aircraft that survived incredible punishment. The crews who completed their tours against impossible odds. The myth celebrated the bomber, but it rarely mentioned the crews who did not return, or the aircraft that disappeared on their first mission, or their fifth, or their 24th. Today, a few restored B-17s still fly at air shows. Visitors walk through their narrow fuselages. They hear the engines roar and feel the vibration of the aircraft in flight. Through the plexiglass, knows the view of the sky is beautiful. The experience feels powerful, but it is only a shadow of what the original crews experienced. Because the original crews flew with the knowledge that someone was trying to kill them. They knew their bomber was only one aircraft among hundreds. They knew the flak below was aimed not at individuals, but at entire formations. They knew that skill alone could not guarantee survival. And they knew that sometimes luck ran out without warning. For the men who flew B-17s in combat, success had a very different meaning than it does in history books. Success was completing a mission when the bomber beside you exploded. Success was landing with wounded crewmen aboard. Success was staying conscious when the oxygen system failed. Success was simply surviving. The legend remembers the aircraft. The truth remembers the men who flew it. Men who discovered that no fortress, no matter how strong, could truly protect them from the war they had been sent to fight.